The group you just heard was the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, one of the many quote-unquote girl bands of the jazz era in the United States. Today, I'll be giving an overview on the history of women in jazz, and looking specifically at the history and impact of the International Sweethearts. I was initially drawn to this topic when I realized that I couldn't name a single woman jazz instrumentalist, even though I just graduated from a women's college in New York City, and you'd think they'd be all over that. Jazz history tends to focus solely on men, and when women are mentioned, it's almost always women jazz singers. Because of this, I had kind of assumed that there just weren't any excellent female jazz instrumentalists. Of course, after doing research, I learned that that's not true. Just like pretty much every other profession, there were extremely talented women in the field from the beginning. We just aren't taught about them. As a classical flute player, I'm used to being surrounded by extremely talented women. Flute is one of the only instruments where there's a higher percentage of women players than men. But as someone who also works as a woodwind doubler in musical theater pits, most of which are jazz-based, I'm generally the only woman in the section, and sometimes the only woman in the room. And when I told my undergraduate flute professor that I wanted to double, she gave me this skeptical look, and the first thing she said was, "You know you'll have to lug around all those instruments, right?" And I responded, "Yeah, I know. I can do that." And she said, "Huh, okay. I guess I've just never thought of you as strong." So even in the 21st century, after feminism has come such a long way, there's still this aura of skepticism about women playing wind instruments in jazz. So to start, I wanted to give a brief overview of girl bands in general, as they were something that I hadn't heard of before doing this research. I will mention that even the name girl band says a lot about how people saw women instrumentalists at the time. It's not all women's band, it's girl band, which serves to infantilize and delegitimize these often world-class ensembles. But back to the history. Girl bands were a popular form of entertainment during the Jazz Age, centered around the 1930s and 40s. At the time, women were not encouraged to be musicians. If they chose to go into music, it was assumed that they would either sing or play the piano. I watched an old news broadcast from the era, and the newscaster said that women should stand in front of the band, sing, and look pretty. And if they insist upon playing an instrument, it should be piano, because that's the instrument that takes the least amount of physicality. Over time, women started realizing that if they wanted to play, they would need to form all-women groups, since they wouldn't be allowed to play in male spaces. And thus, the all-women bands began. Most of them were formed solely of white women, though there were a few all-black ensembles and one integrated ensemble. They often made a living touring around the country and playing for TV and radio shows, kind of as a gimmick, like, hey, look at these girls play. The popularity of them exploded during World War II, since most of the male musicians were fighting in the war. One of the sayings of the time was, "If the boys are away, the girls will play." Along with playing in the United States, several girl bands were able to tour around the world during World War II and play for the troops. The popularity of girl bands decreased during the 1950s as rock and roll began to take over the music sphere. And by the 60s and 70s, women were beginning to become accepted into previously all-male spaces, so the need for all-women ensembles diminished even further. One specific girl band I'm interested in covering today is the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, which was the first integrated all-women's band in the United States. The Sweethearts were founded in 1938 at Piney Woods Country Life School, which was a school specifically for low-income black children. The school's principal, Lawrence C. Jones, began the Sweethearts after being inspired by Ina Ray Hutton's all-girl Melodiers. After 3 years, the Sweethearts became a professional act and severed ties with Piney Woods, going on to tour across America. The majority of the musicians were black, but there were also Southeast Asian, white, Indian, Puerto Rican, and Native American musicians, all of whom were 14 to 19 years old at the time the band began. They quickly became renowned and played in many famous and historical venues. They performed predominantly for black audiences in theaters such as the Apollo Theater in Harlem, the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., the Regal Theater in Chicago, and the $1 Million Theater in Los Angeles. As I said, they were immensely popular at the time, and they actually broke a box office record at the Howard Theater, bringing in over 35,000 patrons in a week. I mentioned earlier that several girl bands toured across the world during World War II, and the Sweethearts were one of those bands. They were a huge hit for black infantrymen and were able to tour around Europe in the 1940s.
When you're feeling low and you don't know what to do, just stay in the groove, let nothing bother you.
Being an integrated band in the United States in the time of Jim Crow presented many serious obstacles for the band. According to pianist Johnny May Rice, the band practically lived on the tour bus, using it not only for living and touring space, but also for rehearsals and school classes, since they would have been unsafe going out in public. The white young women were told to say that they had a black mother and a white father if they were ever asked, and when they performed on stage, they had to wear foundation that was slightly darker than their natural skin tone so that they could pass as mixed race and not be questioned by the police. Saxophonist Roz Cron told the story that one night a police officer approached her and asked about her race, and she told the normal lie about her mom being black and her dad being white, but the cops searched her wallet and found a photo of her and her parents who were both white, and she ended up spending the night in jail. Nevertheless, the Sweethearts supported each other and did their best to stay safe and play great music, and they gained acclaim throughout the country. They toured until 1949, and then ended up disbanding after the death of their band leader, Ray Lee Jones. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm were an incredibly important group for several reasons. First and foremost, they paved the way for acceptance of racial integration in popular culture in a time where that was almost unheard of. Having a group of women play as a cohesive unit comprised of musicians of different ethnicities was a novel concept at the time, and it helped prove that race shouldn't be a dividing line, especially not in music. While this was less obvious to the eye, there were also several queer women in the group who were accepted and protected by the others. One of these women was trumpeter Tiny Davis, who was the subject of a 1988 documentary called Tiny and Ruby, Helldivin' Women. The Sweethearts were also the subject of many feminist papers and documentaries over the coming decades, including feminist scholar Rosetta Wright's 1986 oral biography of the Sweethearts, and a documentary film that premiered at the New York Film Festival in the 80s called International Sweethearts of Rhythm, America's Hottest All-Girl Band. In 2012, the Library of Congress selected the compilation album The International Sweethearts of Rhythm, Hottest Women's Band of the 1940s, for preservation in the National Recording Registry for being, quote, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Here's a clip from that album. Over time, the jazz world has evolved to become more inclusive of women and non-binary folks. When the women's liberation movement started exploding in the 70s, women were able to start really asserting themselves in all facets of life, including jazz. In 1978, Carol Comer and Diane Gregg started the first jazz festival that featured women, named the Kansas City Women's Jazz Festival. It was meant to be a one-time occurrence, but due to popular demand, it ran for 8 years. It featured a mixture of up-and-comers in the jazz world and the great jazz stars of the time, including Melba Liston, Toshiko Akiyoshi, and Mary Lou Williams. And at the second annual Kansas City Women's Jazz Festival, the surviving members of the International Sweethearts came together and performed a set. Nowadays, there's a more natural integration of women in jazz, though there's still a while to go. Women that I've talked to have said that they often feel excluded in the jazz world due to quote unquote bro culture and the undercurrents of sexism that remain even today. Classical musicians have taken steps to combat sexism by implementing blind auditions, where the audition committee knows nothing about the identity or appearance of the applicant, which, surprise, surprise, has led to an increase of women being hired. So far, though, there is no such process in the jazz or musical theater worlds, both of which rely heavily on personal connections and subbing instead of auditions. Overall, though, there definitely has been an upward trend in acceptance of women in jazz over the last 80 years or so. Contemporary women jazz stars have spoken about how grateful they are for the bravery and perseverance of the women in the 30s, 40s, and beyond for paving the way for greater equality in the jazz world. Education is so important. If young girls looking into jazz are met with only male players, it's much easier for them to get discouraged. But if they're taught about all women groups of the 30s and 40s and the women breakout stars of the 50s and beyond, then they can have tangible role models to look up to. For me personally, watching videos of the Sweethearts and other girl bands of the era swinging and grooving together was so heartwarming and encouraging. There's a place for women in jazz. There always has been.